Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Carlson. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today for the Hart Nikachos Endowed Lecture in Peace Studies. Thanks for making the trek over here today. I know for some folks, especially some of my students, it's a bit of a haul. I saw them hiring Sherpas along the way to help them with their bags, but thanks for being here. As you know, I sometimes try to start off with the joke to lighten things up, but you know, it's been such a slow week in the news. There was hardly anything to talk about, right? But I got one for you. Here we go. So you may have heard that President Trump's foreign policy advisors recently asked him how he felt about a two-state solution. You know how he replied? He says, "I love it. It's a great idea. Let's add Canada and Greenland." And they said, "Sir, no, the two-state solution." He says, that's about the Middle East. He says, okay, we'll take Gaza too. So anyway, this is where we are. These are, of course, serious matters. Sometimes we need to keep our little humor just to stay sane, right? Okay, a few housekeeping matters. As always, if you have your cell phone, please go ahead and turn that off so Great Aunt Sally doesn't call you in the middle of the lecture. It does happen. And if you would, please no video or audio or photographs, etc. During the event. We do have a live stream audience welcome, and this event will be posted on our YouTube channel afterwards, but that's all sort of the official proceedings and recordings. And for those joining us in person, we will have a reception afterwards, so join us for cookies and conversation after the event. And that's why my students have to come in person, because you can't get cookies if you just watch this online. So we have a very full schedule of events this spring, thanks to the robust planning, and I want to give a special shout out to the planning and promotion of these events by our event coordinator, Alex Brooks, and our communications manager, Dawn Beeson. They are awesome. They have done so much work preventing these events, so let's give them a quick round of applause, if you would. One particular event I want to highlight is on April 9th. We will have a visit from a New York Times columnist, David French, for an event on religion and the rule of law. It's a conversation about truth in politics. And if you haven't already signed up for our mailing list, I encourage you to do so. Please pick up our spring schedule out in the lobby, and you can always get everything that you need on our website, csrc.asu.edu. Thank you to all of our donors. As you know, this event today is part of the endowment that was created by Ann Hart. And this is actually the 20th anniversary of our first Peace Studies lecture by theologian Stanley Hauerwas in 2005. So Ann was a generous donor. She was professor emerita here at the Mary Lou Fulton College of Education. She was a devout Quaker. Her deep religious beliefs motivated her commitment to peace, to conflict resolution. She unfortunately passed away in November, but her endowment has created a lasting legacy, not only for the last 20 years, but going forward through this lecture and other programming. So I share this because if you ever wonder what difference can a gift make, this is the difference it makes. We absolutely depend on the vital partnership of our donors and friends of the center, and I thank you. I want to thank all of you, every one of you who have given this past year, and I invite others who would like to learn about giving to talk with any of us about those opportunities. Whether you, let's see. Okay, so here we go. I just normally don't do this, but I wanted to give a little bit of a context about where we find ourselves today. You know, the war in Gaza, the wider conflict since October 7th, and of course, well before that, it weighs heavily on many people's minds, on our hearts. What our speaker has to say today may resonate deeply with you. You may find this talk affirming, clarifying. You may find some of what's said does not represent your experience or those whom you know. Whether you find today's event affirming or disturbing, inspiring or offensive, thank you for being here. Right? Thank you for engaging. It's important. It's part of our center's mission, our mandate to take up sensitive, controversial, difficult issues. We are a center devoted to the understanding of religion and conflict, after all, right? So we're not doing any service to anyone by trying to always make sure that we say something that we hope everyone will agree with. Now, some have asked me in email and other forms, and I appreciate them reaching out to me, how does this discussion foster peace? What's the idea of labeling this under a peace studies? Well, the pursuit of peace requires, among other things, a willingness to listen, to engage the perspective of others, whether we share them or not. So, whatever is going on, in spite of these differences, there are also many things that we share, and we shouldn't lose sight of them. We all understand the importance of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, the region. It matters a lot. The stakes are very high. The challenges are there. The need for progress is real. We share a desire for civic engagement, for dialogue, and we also, as members of this ASU community, share a commitment to free speech. It's an intellectual commitment, I hope, to listening respectively to others and to the arguments that they make and to engaging them critically, thoughtfully, carefully. So to that end, we will have some opportunity for questions after the lecture. If you saw the question cards in the beginning, you may have picked one up. We will also bring them around during the Q&A time. And with that, I'm going to now turn things over to my dear colleague, Professor Yasmin Saikia, who is the Hart Nikachos Chair in Peace Studies. She will introduce our speaker today. I thank Yasmin for her leadership in the center, for her intellectual contributions, developing scholarship and programming here at ASU. Yasmin.
Thank you, John. Thanks. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. I'm Yasmin Saikia, and I hold the Hart Nikachos Chair in Peace Studies. This is the 15th year that I am doing the annual Peace Lecture. And this year is particularly in remembrance of Anne Hart, whose profound legacy of peace work that I'm honored to be continuing that discussion here today with Laila Al-Arian, an award-winning journalist, author, and filmmaker, as our distinguished speaker for the 2025 Hart Nikachos Peace Lecture. Currently serving as the executive producer of Al Jazeera's flagship US investigative program, Fault Lines, Al-Arian has established herself as a powerful voice for understanding and justice through her remarkable career in multimedia journalism. Anne, who was the benefactor of the Peace Initiative at CSRC, began her transformative journey in the 1970s in Ramallah, Palestine, where her experiences sparked a lifelong commitment to fostering peace among diverse communities in the region. As we mourn Anne's passing in 2024, inviting Laila Al-Arian serves as a meaningful tribute to Anne's vision and her enduring dedication to peace building. With more than 15 years of experience spanning print, digital, and video journalism, Al-Arian's work has appeared in prestigious outlets, including The Nation, Salon, and the New York Times. Her commitment to uncovering truth and promoting understanding is perhaps most powerfully demonstrated in the book Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians, co-authored with Chris Hedges, which brings to light the human cost of conflict. The resonance between Al-Arian's work and Anne Hart's legacy is striking. Through her pioneering journalism, recognized with 2 Emmy Awards and 14 nominations, Al-Arian has carved out vital spaces for dialogue and understanding, echoing Anne's steadfast belief in the power of cross-cultural engagement. Her documentaries have earned prestigious recognition, including the National Association of Black Journalists Best Documentary Award for Ferguson, A City Under Siege. If you have not watched it, please do watch it. And both a Peabody Award and Robert F. Kennedy's Award in Journalism for Made in Bangladesh, which is a story of garment workers, achievement that underscores her dedication to amplifying voices that often go unnoticed. As the current Hart-Nicholson Chair in Peace Studies, I see profound connections between Al-Arian's approach and my own research on violence and reconciliation in South Asia. We share a commitment to amplifying marginalized voices and illuminating paths towards peace across cultural boundaries. Her investigative reporting brings critical attention to human rights issues while maintaining the humanity of all involved, a principle that lies at the heart of genuine peace building and exemplifies the values that Anne Hart championed throughout her life. Al-Arian's remarkable body of work spans the United States, Middle East, and South Asia, demonstrating how thoughtful journalism can bridge divides and foster mutual understanding. Her approach is particularly relevant in our current global context, where understanding across cultural and religious boundaries is more crucial than ever before. The insights she brings from covering complex international issues will enrich our understanding of peace building in today's interconnected world. This lecture represents not only a tribute of Anne Hart's legacy, but also an investment in the future of peace studies that she envisioned. Al-Arian's presence honors the mission of the Hart-Nicholson Chair Lecture Series while bringing fresh perspectives on how we might continue as normal people living in Arizona with a vital work of peace building in our troubled times that is happening all over, not just here or there, but everywhere, and we belong there. Thank you so much for allowing me to invite Al-Arian, and I have the honor to introduce her today and to invite her to present the Hart-Nicholson Chair Peace Studies for 2025. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Yasmin Saikia, for that extremely generous introduction. I'm deeply honored to be the keynote speaker of this year's Hart-Nicholson Peace Studies Conference, whose theme is misrepresenting Muslims in the media. I want to begin by thanking the team at Arizona State University Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict for organizing this event, in particular Dr. Yasmin Saikia, Dr. John Shangio, Dr. John Carlson, as well as all of the staff members who worked so hard to put this important event and this important conference together. Sorry, I forgot to start my timer. And thank you all for being here, whether you're an audience member or you're presenting your own papers. You know, I was going to ask the question that Dr. Carlson said he got emails about at the very end of my talk, but I actually decided, you know what, why don't I start with it? How does this foster peace? How does this critique of media coverage of the genocide in Gaza contribute to fostering peace? I would say there's no peace without justice, truth, and accountability. And to get to peace, we need to have justice, truth, and accountability, and we need to have some difficult conversations to get there. My topic today is on reporting Gaza. I'll be looking at the failure of Western media and one small effort to document a genocide. I'm here speaking not as an academic or someone who has formally studied these issues, although I have many academics in my family, so I'm an academic by association. But I'm laying them out as a journalist who's worked in the field for more than 20 years and who knows media malpractice when I see it. And what a time to be speaking on this issue. Just 2 days ago, as Dr. Carlson mentioned, President Trump shared a horrifying plan to forcibly displace Palestinians in Gaza from their homes, move them to Egypt or Jordan or elsewhere, and have the US take over that land. In any other situation, media institutions would describe this for what it is: ethnic cleansing and forced displacement. But because this is about Palestinians, you see the New York Times call it, quote, one of the most audacious ideas advanced by an American leader. They then changed that to brazen. Meanwhile, The Guardian wrote about it like this, quote, forced displacement of Gaza's population would probably be a violation of international law. Quote, some human rights advocates liken the idea to ethnic cleansing. The use of descriptors like audacious reminds me of how Western legacy media talked about Israel's pager attacks in Lebanon, which killed many civilians, including children, and maimed many as well. In what other scenario would an attack that killed and maimed children be hailed for its technology and described as, quote, amazing, ingenious, and eye-catching? Both of these examples, one quite recent and one from several months ago, tell us a disturbing truth about the new news media's coverage of the Middle East more broadly and the genocide of Gaza in particular during the last 16 months. And it's raising important and some may argue existential questions about the legitimacy of many news organizations in the eyes of their audience. For months, I called the media coverage a monumental failure. I likened it to Western media coverage that helped pave the way for the Iraq War in the early 2000s, when journalists laundered lies and disinformation about non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which they were later forced to apologize for. But as time went on, it became clear that more than a monumental failure, in many cases, what we've seen in the media coverage of Gaza is an active complicity in the genocide. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and some excellent work has been produced by some of the very outlets I will cite. But by and large, these outlets have either failed in their duty to inform the public about what Israel has inflicted on Gaza, or in many cases, they have abetted the Israeli government and military in spreading their propagandistic talking points, which are intended to justify the destruction of the land and the people of Gaza. When we look back at this time, what we will remember is the sheer disconnect from what we've seen on our screens, whether it's Al Jazeera or social media, and the mainstream Western media coverage. The disconnect amounts to the media coverage telling us, don't believe your eyes and don't believe your ears. For 470 days of Israel's genocide in Gaza, we witnessed horrors beyond our comprehension or our imagination. Every single day for 15 months straight, Israel inflicted horrors on Gaza that if they were happening anywhere else in the world would be front page news, breaking news alerts sent directly to our phones, signaling that these deaths, these atrocities are unacceptable. When it first began in October 2023, two videos became seared in my mind. One was of a mother sobbing after her children were killed in an airstrike, saying they died while they were hungry. It might seem like a strange reaction to losing the people she cared about most deeply, but it showed that she had a mother's instinct to feed her babies even to the very end. The other video was of two young boys in a hospital, not much younger than my own two sons. Maybe they were about 8 and 10 years old. Both of them were covered in blood. One of the brothers could see that his brother was dying, and he was telling him to say the Muslim declaration of faith as he was taking his last breaths. The stream of videos like this only got worse as the genocide went on, and they never stopped. We continue to see them now, today, during the so-called ceasefire. We saw video after video of parents collecting the remains of their children, skin, bones, limbs, and putting them in plastic bags. The world was shocked to see a young man, 19-year-old Shaban al-Dalu, burned alive while he was still attached to an IV, receiving treatment from an earlier attack by Israel. But when the media, and in particular the Western media, declines to cover these horrors the way they would if they were inflicted against Israelis or Ukrainians, for example, it signals that Palestinian death is expected and accepted. It normalizes Palestinian death, just as it did before October 7th, just as it continues now with every killing of a Palestinian in Gaza after the ceasefire, or West Bank cities like Jenin and Nablus, where Palestinians are being killed right now in record numbers. Despite the valiant and courageous efforts of journalists in Gaza, I fear that we don't even know a fraction of the crimes that the Israeli military committed there. It will take time for them to be revealed, and some of them we may never know. The vast majority of the at least 61,000 people killed, did you know that the death toll was updated a few days ago? You may not know if you're following mainstream media because none of them wrote about it. 61,000 people killed during these 470 days are women, children, and the elderly. Israel broke all manner of records in its genocide of Palestinians, the most children killed in conflict zones around the world each year since 2019. This record was achieved many months ago. The most journalists killed in any conflict in decades, this too was achieved many months ago. A record number of aid workers killed. The bombing of Gaza is the most destructive this century by some accounts, surpassing even the bombs dropped during World War II in Hamburg, London, and Dresden combined. Israel has destroyed every university in Gaza and so many schools and mosques and bakeries and hospitals. They've attacked water stations, fishing boats, aid convoys, children getting water, adults lining up for flour, people burying their dead, grandmothers waving white flags. They've sniped children in the head and heart and executed men point blank in front of their wives and children. Israel has destroyed everything that gives and sustains life in a place. It hasn't even left the dead in peace as it bulldozed over graveyards and dug up the bodies of the dead repeatedly. And yet, despite the scale of this destruction, the media coverage has been staggeringly inadequate. And we can't overstate the power and influence of media coverage. It shapes public opinion, signals what's important, whose lives are worthy. It drives the conversations at the White House and on Wall Street and around the world. News coverage creates a narrative that becomes entrenched and can be hard, if not impossible, to undo. So what are some specific ways the media has failed to cover this story or has been actively complicit in the manufacturing of consent for the genocide? Number one, misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda campaigns. There's a pattern of Western media reporting as fact, unverified, sensationalist allegations that have been shaping the narrative. What this essentially amounts to is laundering stories from the Israeli PR machine through the media. From the beginning, right after October 7th, Israel sought to portray Hamas as ISIS, even trying to name them Hamas-ISIS, which never really took off. That official state narrative included disseminating very specific inflammatory details that turned out to be false. In particular, that Hamas-led fighters beheaded babies on October 7th, that they put babies in ovens, and that they carried out a systematic campaign of mass rape. These claims played on deeply racist and Islamophobic tropes about Arabs and Muslims, and were widely circulated only to be retracted or walked back later, long after the damage was done. We saw major networks and newspapers abandon the basic principles of journalism, verification, fairness, and accountability. The instinct was not to question or investigate, but to amplify and justify, ensuring that Israel's military actions were given a moral cover. These horrifying but fabricated details are intended to shock and disgust and portray Palestinian men as irredeemable monsters and Gaza as a place deserving of utter destruction. The Israeli narrative is not questioned, as Western media regurgitated many of these details, putting them on front pages and on breaking news alerts. There was no independent verification process. Claims were not reported out. The rules of journalism went out the window. And this had an impact. President Biden went on television to tell the country that he had personally seen photos of beheaded Israeli babies, photos that, of course, we all know did not exist and that he had never seen. In fact, the White House was later forced to admit as much. Biden also claimed that the death numbers by the Palestinian Ministry of Health were unreliable. That effort to question the numbers appears to have originated from a former Reuters journalist named Luke Baker, who works for a public relations company in the UK. As he lambasted journalists for reporting the Gaza Health Ministry's casualty numbers, he demanded that it be labeled the, quote, Hamas-run health ministry. And many news organizations quickly fell into line. No one questioned who Baker may have been working for as a PR consultant or what his real motivation was. It didn't matter that the actual data from previous wars on Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021 showed that the health ministry's numbers were accurate. It didn't matter that a State Department official testified in Congress that the number Biden was questioning was in fact an undercount. Facts go out the window in favor of whatever Israel's propaganda campaign of the day is. And those campaigns often came at very specific, sensitive moments when Israel was carrying out especially brutal violence. For example, during its first attack against Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa, journalists from CNN to the New York Times had front-page articles regurgitating the unproven claims that the hospital served as a command and control center for Hamas. Let's be clear, Israel never provided credible evidence for this before or after the attacks on the hospital. In fact, the so-called proof that it did provide included clearly staged photos of weapons by an MRI machine. We all know what metal does to an MRI machine. A calendar that simply stated days of the week that Israel propagandists tried to claim was evidence that hostages were being held there, and a fake video of an Israeli actress with a very bad accent pretending to be a nurse at Al-Shifa claiming Hamas was operating out of there. Despite being caught repeatedly fabricating evidence, Israel continued to be deferred to and used as a trusted source by Western media organizations. This is unusual, to say the least. In journalism, when reporters are repeatedly burned by a source who lies to them, they decide to no longer use that source. But it doesn't seem to matter how often the Israeli state has outright lied to or misled journalists. It continues to be seen and used as a credible source. And there are ample examples of high-profile lies, just a few of them, even predate October 7th. In 2021, Israel told a group of journalists that it was going to carry out a ground invasion in Gaza. And later, it admitted that that wasn't true. It was a psyop. They had used the journalists to report that to get Hamas into the tunnels so they can bomb them. They openly admitted to using the media as a war tactic. In 2022, after killing the Palestinian-American Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, Israel spun a web of lies about the circumstances of her killing in Jenin in the northern West Bank, releasing a video of a Palestinian fighter to suggest that's who killed her. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem immediately debunked that, sending their own team to the site, showing that it was impossible. They said, okay, well then she was killed in crossfire. But numerous news and human rights organizations, including my program, Fault Lines, conducted independent investigations to show that Shireen was in fact killed by an Israeli sniper. It wasn't until all of that, and I should say her killing is the most investigated killing of any Palestinian in history. It wasn't until all of that that Israel was forced to admit the truth. But even then, that truth was hedged, saying, okay, maybe it was one of our soldiers, but it was unintentional, without explaining how a very precise sniper shot between Shireen's flak jacket and her helmet right here could have been anything but targeted. Again, we are told, don't believe your eyes and don't believe your ears. Any sense of truth and logic go out the window. There's a reliance on Israeli army talking points, even when it's clear the Israelis have more incentive than ever to not be truthful. On November 10th, 2023, there was an attack on Al-Shifa hospital, one of many, which the Israelis claimed were misfired projectiles from Palestinian fighters, and the media ran with it. On November 14th, 4 days later, a New York Times open-source investigation concluded the evidence pointed to Israeli shells. But the problem is it's too late. The narrative had already been formed. There's a circular nature to this disinformation. When the State Department was pressed to provide evidence that Al-Shifa was being used by Hamas fighters, the State Department spokesperson pointed to news reports. But news reports are based on unverified and unsubstantiated claims by Israeli and US officials. Another PR campaign that Israel strategically launched at a key moment was the day in January of 2024 that the ICJ decision came out, concluding that Israel was committing plausible genocide. It used key newspapers like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal to disseminate the inflammatory claim that some workers who are part of UNRWA, or the UN Relief and Works Agency, took part in October 7th, obscuring the fact that it's the oldest and largest aid organization operating in Gaza and employs 13,000 people there. It was this story that dominated the headlines for days. 2, selective empathy in the hierarchy of human life. What stories are prioritized? After October 7th, we saw wall-to-wall coverage of Israeli deaths, including interviews with victims, family members, survivors, while almost none of the far more numerous victims in Gaza. Even as Gaza witnessed horror after horror on a daily basis, from Israel shooting at people leaving a hospital in terror and waving white flags, to killing hundreds in their homes in one airstrike at the Jabalia refugee camp, to reports of snipers purposefully targeting children in the ICU of a hospital. But the wall-to-wall coverage of Israel continued unabated. The only message being sent is that Palestinian lives simply don't matter. While Israeli deaths are covered with emotion and detail, Palestinians are nameless statistics. So of course, as a result, the audience will naturally feel more sympathy towards those whose lives are covered in detail. And as all of you who have studied Islamophobia know, none of this is new. As the late Palestinian academic, Palestinian American, Edward Said wrote decades ago in his book covering Islam, quote, "Very little of the detail, the human density, the passion of Arab Muslim life has entered the awareness of even those people whose profession it is to report the Arab world. What we have instead is a series of crude, essentialized caricatures of the Islamic world presented in such a way as to make that world vulnerable to military aggression." Vulnerable to military aggression. Of course, that lack of detail, the human density that Edward Said speaks of, contributes to a dehumanization of Palestinians that justifies their ongoing brutalization. In terms of this disparity in coverage, we saw a similar situation with domestic coverage. Compare how the pro-Palestine coverage on November 4th, 2023 was not covered, compared to a pro-Israel rally in DC a few months later, which was covered widely. Signs like "Let Israel finish the job" or chants of no ceasefire, meanwhile, were not mentioned in the coverage, when you had weeks of journalists wringing their hands over phrases like "from the river to the sea." Similarly, the wall-to-wall coverage of the college encampments and lies about the student protesters, compare that to the scant, if any, coverage of the atrocities committed at hospitals like Al-Shifa and Nasser around the same exact time, including reports of mass graves discovered on their premises. Now let's talk about the power of language and words. We know that in writing, there's an immense power to language, and that writers and editors use very specific words to tell a story and convey meaning. There have been countless examples in the last year and a half of news headlines, we've all seen them, using passive language and not including the perpetrator of the violence against Palestinians in the headlines, in order to absolve Israel of responsibility. The headlines then become riddles that we're all expected to solve, mysteries. So we know that, of course, Israelis are killed while Palestinians simply die. Just some quick examples in the BBC, quote, "The 12-year-old Gazan girl who lost her whole family overnight," or the famous New York Times headline, "Lives Ended in Gaza." Another New York Times headline, "Palestinians are bearing the brunt of lawlessness in Gaza as fighting at Al-Shifa hospital continues." No mention of who is attacking Al-Shifa, and a vague mention of lawlessness, which is unspecific and tells us nothing. This passive construction does not inform the audience. You also saw a creative use of language when covering Israel's war of starvation in Gaza, with the Washington Post putting man-made famine in quotes, despite ample and documented evidence of Israel stating that this was in fact their policy. Similarly, in the New York Times, the headline was, quote, "Famine is projected for northern Gaza, experts say." A global authority on food security said that in the coming months, as many as 1.1 million people in Gaza could face the severest levels of hunger. In 35 words, you have no mention of Israel. You wouldn't know that this was because of a policy of starving the population, that Israeli officials have made that known. You would think it's a drought. Then you have language that minimizes Palestinian suffering. For example, NPR saying that this was a low-intensity phase of the war on a day that an entire Palestinian family was eliminated. We also see terms that are reserved for use for Israelis only, like hostage, despite the fact that Israel arrested thousands of Palestinians after October 7th and did not charge them with any crime, but tortured them in custody anyway. You see the media describing them as prisoners, even while they are being exchanged for Israeli captives who are called hostages. A New York Times, and this is not by accident, this is often by design, a New York Times memo leaked to the Intercept website instructed reporters to avoid using words like occupied territories, ethnic cleansing, genocide, refugee camps, and even Palestine. When asked about it, a New York Times spokesperson said that they issue this guidance, quote, to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance, which one can argue banning these words actually does quite the opposite. Along these lines, you see a use of emotive language when it comes to October 7th, with words like massacre, horrific, slaughter, monstrous, crimes, barbaric, savage, sadistic, brutal. Meanwhile, these words are nowhere to be found when reporting on the killing of Palestinians, when that reporting even happens, which is written in a very straightforward who, what, when, where, why, how, detached way using neutral, non-emotive language. This emotion is not just relegated to the language used in the writing, it also influences when journalists choose to use their voices to speak out and when they remain silent. I will never forget how in the midst of the beheaded babies hoax, CNN anchor Abby Phillip tweeted the I-24, which is an Israeli channel's report that was later debunked, and said, "Don't look away." She also cried on air about it, while she has stayed silent on the killing of more than 15,000 Palestinian children, and this is very much an undercount, who were buried alive under the rubble, died of cold, starvation, were beheaded by US weapons, and burned alive. Those deaths are met with silence and callous indifference. Let's talk about who faces accountability in the media. While Israeli government and military leaders are given ample time on air to spin their narrative and share their perspective, some of them even have contracts with these cable news channels like CNN, they're not asked tough questions or held accountable for specific policies, tactics, or attacks. Instead, what we've seen is these anchors saving their accountability interviews for Palestinians. It doesn't matter who they are. Every Palestinian who comes on is asked if they condemn Hamas. First question always. Before anything else, they're approached with skepticism, interrupted and censored, even if they were invited on as an academic or an expert or someone who has lost family in Gaza. They are treated like they are accountable. One example I also remember is, again, from the same CNN anchor, Abby Phillip. She saved all of her tough questions for a very young student at the University of Southern California who had been elected by her classmates to speak at graduation and was not allowed to speak because of her views on Palestine. She received tough questions from Abby Phillip. Framing and context. The framing of this as a war against Hamas, even as Israeli officials openly talk about punishing the population, committing war crimes, and what looks like a campaign of ethnic cleansing. There are so many statements by Israeli officials making it clear that their intent is genocidal. From Benjamin Netanyahu referring to the people of Gaza as children of darkness, or as Amalek, which the Hebrew Bible says, quote, utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling. That was the approach to Gaza. You also saw an interview with Avi Dichter, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, saying, quote, we are now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. In case you don't know, the Nakba is the forced displacement and the mass slaughter of Palestinians in 1948 that came with the establishment of the State of Israel. News organizations refuse to refer to this as a genocide, have barely covered these comments, if at all, and instead have spilled a lot of ink disputing that it's a genocide. Beyond that, what also characterizes this coverage is a sense that history began on October 7th. What this does is erase the circumstances that Palestinians were living in before then in Gaza. 17 years of a brutal, brutal siege, in which Israel even counted the calories that Palestinians were allowed to consume. Up to 70% youth unemployment rate, possibly the highest in the world. 81% of the population living in poverty, barely any electricity. There's no context that under international law, the blockade of Gaza is a war crime, is a crime against humanity. And that 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank before October 7th. Of course, this lack of context, both historical and current, benefits the Israelis through whom the audience is supposed to see all events. The underlying notion is that they are us and we are them. This is not a new phenomenon since October 7th. Western media has consistently failed to provide the crucial context of Israel's foundation as a settler colonial entity that forcibly expelled the native population, the Palestinians, and dispossessed them of their land, as well as the decades of occupation, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid that followed. For decades, mainstream news outlets have operated under a framework that portrays Israel as the perpetual victim and Palestinians as either aggressors or passive casualties. This framing has led to an inversion of reality where an occupied people fighting for their survival is blamed for the violence unleashed on them. Instead, coverage is often reduced to simplistic narratives of both sides or a real estate dispute, or even, this goes back to the Bible days. How many of us have heard that one? I actually heard it from a member of Congress, believe it or not, literally, who told me they've been fighting since the Bible days. Ignoring the fundamental power imbalance between occupier and occupied. The result is a public that remains misinformed, policymakers who act with impunity, and a global audience that becomes desensitized to Palestinian suffering. The stories they won't tell. In the US media, unlike the Israeli media, which actually has to abide by Israeli censorship laws, there is a virtual ban, I don't know if it's spoken or unspoken, on writing about or discussing Israel's use of the Hannibal procedure on October 7th, in which there is documented evidence, some based on Israeli military investigations, and in the Israeli press, that Israel killed some of its own people on October 7th through air attacks and the shelling of homes. Yet October 7th continues to be reported in the US media, in the Western media, as, quote, Hamas killed nearly 1,200 people, which is just not factual. Other stories that if it was Palestinian fighters doing it, would have definitely garnered front-page feature stories, is the pattern of Israeli soldiers looting the homes of Palestinians and wearing the undergarments and lingerie of Palestinian women they killed or displaced. I think many of us can only imagine how this would have been used to pathologize Arab and Muslim culture if the opposite happened. But again, despite ample evidence based on their own social media posts, this story has been absent from the coverage, as has the documented sexual torture and abuse of Palestinians in Israeli detention, including Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, a doctor from Gaza who was raped to death, which has either been undercovered or minimized. Let's talk about the journalists of Gaza. Gaza has been closed to the international journalists, the international media, since October 7th, unless they go in through IDF embeds. They had to agree that the IDF would sign off on their reporting, and they couldn't broadcast or print anything without their sign-off. This has meant that the burden of covering everything that's happened in Gaza has fallen on the shoulders of Palestinian journalists, who are in the best position to cover it anyway. More than 200 Palestinian journalists have been killed in Israeli attacks in Gaza since October 7th. This is an unprecedented number, a staggering figure. 75% of the journalists killed in 2023 were killed in Gaza. And yet, we see two problems: a lack of coverage of this that communicates the urgency and life and death stakes, and a general lack of solidarity from the journalism community. I cannot imagine this being the case if this were happening anywhere else. Journalists' families have also been killed, such as Al Jazeera's Wa'il al-Dahdouh, whose wife, 2 children, and grandchild were targeted in an Israeli airstrike. This was after they relocated to the south at Israel's instruction. Just days after their killing, the New Yorker wrote an article about Wa'il suggesting that Al Jazeera was Hamas propaganda, in one of the most shameful pieces of journalism produced in the past 16 months. In the face of this callous indifference, silence, or in the case of the New Yorker, active demonization of these journalists, the Israeli military enjoyed impunity to keep attacking journalists as they were doing their jobs. Meanwhile, Ukrainian journalists were honored by my industry in the US with the biggest awards in journalism and lauded for their courage and dedication. The attacks on journalists are not just physical. A pro-Israel group called Honest Reporting, accused journalists in Gaza of having prior knowledge of October 7th with no evidence. When the New York Times and the Associated Press looked into it and proved them wrong, they admitted they were just raising questions and that they're not a news organization. But unfortunately, these news organizations have given them legitimacy all too often and emboldened them when they fired or stopped working with numerous Palestinian journalists based on this pro-Israel lobby group's word. In part to push back against some of these practices, which I just described in detail, but also to do the essential work of uncovering war crimes through investigative journalism, my team and I at Fault Lines produced a documentary called The Night Won't End, which examines Israel's war on Gaza through the experiences of 3 families. We wanted to push back against the daily experience of people scrolling through their phones, seeing nameless family after nameless family. And we wanted to put you in the shoes of these 3 families. We meticulously investigated an airstrike that killed more than 100 members of the Salim family in Gaza City, including 50 children. We looked at the case of Hind Rajab, the 5-year-old girl who pleaded for her life after Israeli soldiers killed her family, only for her to also be killed along with rescue workers who went to retrieve her after they had gotten clearance from the Israeli military. We worked with open source investigators at Forensic Architecture and Earshot who recreated Hind's family car and the scene on the ground to show that an Israeli tank could likely see her from where they fired 335 bullets into their car. We did all of this working with incredible, diligent, professional journalists on the ground in Gaza who were devoted to their profession, even as they faced the same risks and dangers as the people they were covering, from airstrikes and starvation to displacement and the lack of fuel to just even get around. I'm not trying to praise our work or pat ourselves on the back, because many others have also done important work, but really to contrast it with the problematic coverage I talked about earlier. We knew, especially given this topic, that the reporting had to be factual and bulletproof. When we reported on a field execution in our film of at least 11 men in front of their families, we interviewed every survivor we could, collected contemporaneous WhatsApp messages, voicemails, every piece of footage we could, even the horrifying aftermath of the bodies. Our mission, first and foremost, was to tell the truth, amplify the voices of the vulnerable, and to hold the powerful to account. But this was just one effort. As we've seen in the last year, the consequences of media silence are immense. It invisibilizes Palestinians and their suffering and encourages impunity, which allows crimes against them to continue unabated. But the consequences for the media also can't be overstated. There's a crisis of audience trust and confidence, and much of that can now be attributed to their coverage of Gaza, which exposed the hypocrisy and double standards of media organizations in the same way that it has forever tainted other institutions, from academia, yes, academia, to the medical profession, to human rights organizations. I wanted to end with a question. How many of you are still following what's happening in Gaza and now in the West Bank? Okay, that's heartening. I know that it can be difficult and heart-wrenching to continue monitoring what's happening there. I know that there's a real mental health impact to that. But the very least each and every one of us can do is to bear witness, to support the reporting, shedding light on the injustices, to firmly reject the notion that the killing of Palestinians is something that can just happen in the background and in the dark. History will remember this moment, and it will remember where we stood. The next generation will look back at this time and ask whether we remained silent or raised our voices against injustice. Bearing witness, amplifying the voices of the oppressed, and demanding accountability is the very least all of us can do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have few questions that we will take, and Laila Al-Arian can respond to them. And at 5:45, we will break. People who want to stay on and talk, you're more than welcome. But I know there are students who have to move on, so that's the reason that 5:45, but we'll go on. So let's take the first question I haven't looked at you. Can you tell us why the International Red Cross has not provided the press a health status on any of the Israeli hostages?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know this is a concern for a lot of people. I don't know the inner workings of the International Red Cross. I know that it's the work that they do is very important and very sensitive. I also know that Hamas did offer to return all of the civilian hostages right after October 7th in exchange for Israel not carpet bombing Gaza, but unfortunately Israel refused that offer.
Following that, there's a very similar question about the sources, or from your sources or any source of information on the remaining 79 hostages, specifically Shiri Babs, Kifir Bebas, and Ariel Bebas.
So I believe with the Bebas children, it was reported that they were unfortunately killed in an Israeli airstrike, I believe in November of I'm like losing track of time. I think 2023, unfortunately, tragically. What I'm seeing is Israel's politicizing their case, possibly in order to galvanize support for a restart of the war on Gaza. And it's really tragic for their case to be used that way.
And the remaining 79 hostages?
I don't personally have an in with people keeping the hostages. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe there's more information in the Israeli press about that.
Okay, another question we have is informational. Have you ever reported on the extensive medical support given to the Gazan Palestinian civilians that require surgery in Israel? The Palestinian civilians who have been receiving medical aid. Have you reported on that?
This was not something that we looked into in our reporting on war crimes. I don't believe that that has been actually available as an option. What we did report on, if you all are interested in the maiming of Palestinian children, it's believed now that the group of children in Gaza represent the largest pediatric cohort of child amputees per capita. And we did make a film about that called All That Remains, which is available on YouTube if you're interested. It's the story of a 13-year-old girl named Layan Abul-Ata who came to the United States for medical treatment after losing a leg in an Israeli attack.
Okay, there's another question about hostages. What is the reason at the hostage release points to have a stage banner and ceremony with civilians after 430 days in captivity?
This is about the way that the hostages have been released. I mean, I can't speak to Hamas's motivations for the way that it has released the hostages, but I can say I'm very relieved that they look so healthy, that they say they were treated very well, they were fed even though Gaza was going through a war of starvation. And if you compare it to the treatment of Palestinians who are leaving Israeli custody with torture marks, with horrific stories of their beards being plugged. Of course, I mentioned Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, who was raped to death, but there were other cases as well. So that contrast, I think, is quite stunning, and it's a relief that the hostages are leaving in good health.
Okay, here we now move from information to something more interpretational. Why don't we hear the diverse opinions of those living in Gaza that oppose Hamas and PIJ?
So of course, Gaza is a place with 2 million people. There's a diversity of opinion. I think in the Western media there is an interest in highlighting the voices of those that oppose Hamas because the Western media often takes the position of the US government. So I do think those voices are actually well represented.
Can you read this during the first?
It says, during Trump's first presidency, there was a sentiment that he was unpalatable to the West or Western media who would disassociate with him. With Trump 2.0 and its alignment to new media, Twitter, Meta, TikTok, how do you imagine our access to news will change, and what can we do about it? It's a really good question. I think that you already see kind of a difference in tone in the way that the media has approached this Trump administration. Certainly, if you were to ask these newsrooms, they would say they are critically covering President Trump's administration. However, you see a marked difference in at least the tone, and even the fact that, for example, at CNN, Jim Acosta left the network because he was seen as kind of being the more combative reporter when it came to the Trump administration. So I think the differences we can already see, but it's still a little bit early. It'll be interesting to see how that continues. As far as what you can do about it, I mean, support the outlets that you trust that are doing a good job. I think there's a sentiment among people that they shouldn't pay for news. That's kind of what led in part to so many news organizations going under. So if you appreciate a news organization's work, donate, support it, go on their website or support their work.
A very similar question. Is there benefit in reaching out to the media outlets and the companies about the Zionist agenda method of reporting? I have done so with my own company, and it fell on deaf ears. What else can be done to challenge this narrative?
It's a good question. I would say if you do find certain reporting to be problematic or biased, please make your voices heard. It does make a difference. I know it can feel like it's falling on deaf ears, but it's better than doing nothing. So it's even better if there's more than one person making their voices heard, but newsrooms do pay attention to reader and audience feedback. It's important to them. It affects their bottom line. I think you should empower yourself by making your voice heard. And as I mentioned, I think you should support the work of people who are doing a good job.
Have you seen any tangible impact from investigative journalism in terms of holding government or institutions accountable?
It's a good question. I mean, I think generally speaking, of course, we've seen investigative journalism change the world, create new laws, take down, corrupt politicians. Very broadly speaking, investigative journalism can be incredibly powerful and effective. I think it's been difficult with the war on Gaza for all the reasons I mentioned, of the mainstream media, especially the most powerful institutions, having a pro-Israel bias and kind of acting on it. But investigative journalism is more important and more needed than ever. And I think, it's important to continue documenting and reporting and exposing crimes and corruption and holding the powerful and the elected to account and serving as the watchdog for the public.
Okay, continuing with the same thing is, how does the reporting on Gaza in the US contrast with reporting elsewhere in the world? Are the other countries also affected as censored by Israel?
I would say some of the same issues I described in US newsrooms also apply to, for example, newsrooms in England. So we saw a report in Dropsite News, the website, showing that within the BBC there was a tremendous pro-Israel bias that was well documented, to the point where people have resigned from their jobs, have called them out for their bias. It's not just based on the testimony of whistleblowers. You actually can see the bias day to day in the way that the BBC reports the news. But we've also heard complaints from even like the Guardian's newsroom, the CBC in Canada's newsrooms. So I would say some of the same issues that I've laid out apply to other newsrooms. And Western media continues to kind of influence the reporting of other news organizations, although, of course, Al Jazeera, which is not perfect, but serves as a counterweight in terms of bringing reporting from the ground in Gaza to homes in both English and Arabic and to audiences all around the world.
Continuing with journalism and holding journalists accountable for the kind of stories we get, here is, given the suppression of the truth and realities of genocide in Gaza by Western media, what do you see as a future of journalism and trust in the media moving forward?
Well, I think we can see from the efforts to shut down TikTok that even though politicians had been talking about shutting down TikTok for years, it wasn't until it proved to be such an influential app and mechanism for people to start learning about Palestine. The fact that when they actually did the analysis, far more people were searching Palestine, what they call like pro-Palestine terms versus pro-Israel terms. That made, I guess, very powerful groups and politicians very nervous. And that effort to shut down TikTok really accelerated based on this fear that the youth were getting corrupted by TikTok. I think you're going to continue seeing that trend of people mistrusting kind of legacy corporate media and going to alternative sources, whether it's Democracy Now! Or Electronic Intifada or Al Jazeera, or social media people using their platforms to kind of bring news and bring stories from the ground in Gaza. Of course, we saw the popularity of journalists and content creators from Gaza, like Bisan Auda, like Mu'taz Azazia, becoming very popular and their work being shared all over. And I think that trend is also going to continue, assuming they're not suppressed and shut down by some of these same social media companies, which we know they have attempted to shadow ban and censor and suppress.
So that takes us to another question about media. Is independent media more beneficial or negative in today's society with so many outlets not having to raise the opinion of US or Israeli-backed groups? Could independent media do something?
I think independent media is incredibly important. I mentioned just a few. I mentioned Democracy Now!, Electronic Intifada, Drop Site News, and The Intercept is just a few examples of outlets that have done fearless, independent reporting that would not, frankly, have appeared anywhere else. So I think it's incredibly important to have independent media. They don't have the same political pressures. They don't have the same newsroom pressures. Fears of censorship, fears of losing corporate, ad dollars, whatever it is, and are bolder and more likely to tell the stories that just will not make it in legacy Western media institutions. So it's incredibly important that we support independent media organizations and that they continue to exist. But it's very, very difficult because a lot of them rely on subscriptions and donations, and it's very expensive to do investigative reporting. So it's important that people who appreciate that work support them and show them that.
So I'll move on to something else now. There are a few more questions in the media. We can come back to it. And as I said, we'll certainly have time to talk, even after 5:45. Here is a couple of questions from students, in a way. The truth about Gaza is being suppressed, and I'm grateful for your heroic work. On the US campus, such as Harvard University, it is not possible to speak openly about these issues. What do you believe students and faculty can do to defend our ability to know the truth?
It's a very good question. I know that the situation right now on university campuses is very intimidating. That is by design. They want to silence you. They want to scare you. They want to intimidate you. They have already made examples out of other students. Columbia University has suspended students. There was just an article the other day on Drop Site News about 3 Columbia students who were suspended. They lost their health care that they desperately needed. Their lives are on hold, and they're now suing the university for retaliating against them simply for First Amendment protected activities, simply for advocacy and activism that they had opposing a genocide. So I think, what to do about it. I think these efforts to suppress are intended to silence, intimidate, and scare people. And the question is whether you're going to accept that or not. Obviously, under this administration, it already began under the previous administration, these efforts are going to accelerate. I think people need to make the decisions that work for them. But I think if all of us are silent, then that scares me about where we are as a country. Because one of the things that we prize so much, that we tell other countries about as the United States, is our ability to have freedom of speech, is our ability to have these difficult conversations, to talk about controversial things, to have a dialogue and a discussion, to talk about issues, ideas. And once we start to self-censor, or once we start to have these powerful institutions shut down speech, that is going to lead to a very dangerous and scary place. And what I find very ironic is some of the very people who decry so-called woke ideology and DEI and whatever it is, who say we want to bring back free speech on campus, are the very people shutting down any speech on Palestine. So I think calling out those double standards and that hypocrisy is important. And I think if it's only one or two people speaking, then those one or two people are vulnerable. But if it's a group speaking, then I think it's much more difficult to shut down.
Okay. Here is another question. As an indigenous person and social worker, how can indigenous nations, professionals, help to support Palestinian reporters?
Thank you for that question, for your work. I would say, a lot of them have GoFundMes where they desperately need like very basic things like food and equipment, sharing their work, amplifying them, sending them notes. I know a lot of them are very accessible on social media. A lot of them feel very forgotten. Ismail al-Ghul, an Al Jazeera journalist who was killed on July 30th, was killed simply for reporting. And his colleagues had to go retrieve his body and found that his head had been severed from his body. And so they have had to bury their colleagues. They've had to run for their lives. They have felt hunted. They have felt targeted. They have had to do their work under the most unimaginable circumstances possible. So even sending them a word of support just to say, we see you, you are not forgotten, sharing their work and helping them in any way you can, I think would very much be appreciated.
So this is a question to you. What are the main challenges you have been facing in speaking up against Zionist support rhetoric?
I think it's always difficult to critique your colleagues in the media because, first of all, there's the very petty assumption that you're just jealous because you're not working in a mainstream media newsroom. Putting all of that aside, I think we all know that there's a cost to this kind of critique that I just laid out tonight. It means that all of those doors are closed to me. I'm fine with that. I've made that decision with a clear conscience that genocide is a time that really forces you to figure out what your values are. And for me, speaking truth to power and revealing some of these very glaring problems with the media coverage is worth the cost of being shut out of opportunities. And that's okay. I think obviously people have different calculations they have to make for themselves, but for me, then you just go online and you get a lot of harassment. I think the amount of times that, I just got the most horrendous things said to me, basically hate speech about Palestinians, that they get what they deserve, there's no innocence, the most heinous, disgusting things you can imagine, that everything is made up, every atrocity, it's called Pallywood. They're all actors, none of it is true. So I think that dealing with that denial where you can't even agree on basic facts and a basic truth is very difficult, and you just realize like there's certain people you just can't convince because you're not even trying to open their minds. Their hearts are just closed off, and they will not see Palestinians as human beings no matter what. And I think you just have to accept that that is the reality and move on and try to speak to people who are actually open to your message.
So here are two questions. They very kind of connect together, so we'll take them together. Can you discuss the faulty conflation of Hamas and Palestine as indicated in tonight's questions, and how this strategically detracts from the genocide? And connected to that, there is this question, what are your views of Hamas? Is Hamas a terrorist organization? Was the attack on October 7 justified? What about Israel? How about Israel? How should have Israel responded instead?
Okay. So to answer the first question.
Conflation with Hamas and Palestine.
Of course, Hamas is a political movement. It's, it was the elected government of Gaza. It was elected in 2006. And I think that obviously, not every Palestinian supports Hamas, but I think Hamas is a distraction. And I think that goes to the second question. I'm old enough to know that when I was growing up, Hamas didn't even exist. Hamas was formed in the late 80s. It was the PLO. It was the PFLP. It was name your group. That was the enemy. It was, oh, you Palestinians, you just can't get it together. You can't elect leaders. It's a distraction because it's not the point. The point is the Palestinian people have always been viewed as the enemy for the Zionist project that seeks to depopulate them from their land by any means necessary. And I think Hamas can go away tomorrow and this issue will not go away because the issue is that goes back to 1948 and even before that of the dispossession of the native population of that land for the purpose of the creation of the State of Israel. The Palestinian people have had to face the brunt of the crimes committed by Europe. They had no part in the crimes committed by Europe. They took in Jewish refugees that moved to Palestine in the wake of the Holocaust, and some even before then, in the wake of pogroms. And my grandparents were dispossessed from their land in Jaffa. They were forcibly removed, kicked out from Jaffa at the barrel of a gun. My great-grandfather from my mom's side was killed in 1948 and buried in a mass grave. And that ends up really impacting the rest of your life as a family. So, and when you think about what happened in the Nakba in 1948, and you think about what happened in Gaza during the last 15 months, I mean, what happened in Gaza, the crimes that I've discussed tonight, that we've covered, that we've documented, I mean, it makes the Nakba, to be honest, pale in comparison. So Hamas can go away, but the Palestinians will remain, and they will be a thorn in Israel's side until Israel decides to live with them in peace and to treat them as equals. They cannot continue to occupy them forever. They cannot control their life. Palestinians deserve to live like any other people in freedom, in peace, in dignity, and in order to have self-determination.
Thank you.
I think we can.
There's now a couple of questions around genocide, so we'll take these together. What is the definition of genocide you are using, and why Gaza is genocide? Is there a difference between genocide and ethnic cleansing? And how would you expand the implication of Israel genocide to include additional states or state actors? So is it genocide, ethnic cleansing? Are there others involved also?
So I actually defer to genocide scholars, many of whom right away, I mean, within just a couple of weeks of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, declared it a genocide. Genocide, a lot of people say online, how could it be a genocide if the population has gone up? Genocide actually has nothing to do with the numbers, which of course we know that many tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed. Many are missing, many have been maimed. But it's the intentional, wholesale, or partial destruction of a people because of who they are. That is the definition of genocide. Genocide scholars and experts, such as Professor Ross Siegel and others, Professor Omar Bartov, have said that this is a genocide. Professor Ross Siegel is the descendant of Holocaust survivors and has studied Holocaust studies. So I really very much take his expertise seriously. And I think when you look at the intentionality behind Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, there's no doubt that it's a genocide. When you listen to the testimony of survivors of the Gaza genocide who say, Israeli soldiers came to us and said, you and you and you and you are the enemy. All of you are the enemy. All of you people of Gaza are our enemies, and we can kill anyone, despite the fact that they are unarmed, that they are civilians. I would say our reporting has shown that and has proven that Gaza is a killing cage for the Israeli military. They are killing Palestinians simply for being Palestinians. They are killing them indiscriminately with no thought to who they are or, again, whether they're women, children, armed, unarmed, it doesn't matter. And I think the ICJ has also spoken
Okay, here it goes. Yeah, should we start? Oh, sorry. 5:45, the students who need to leave, you are welcome to leave. So first of all, I want to thank all of you. We'll continue this conversation, but I want to thank all of you who have attended. I want to thank ASU, as some of you have pointed out, that such a conversation is only possible at ASU because ASU takes human issues very seriously, and we take moral issues and ethics and intellectual engagement with these issues very seriously. So I thank ASU for allowing us to do this. Of course, I thank my colleagues at CSRC, John, who is the amazing kind of colleague to have, John Carlson, John Mark, Don Beeson, Alex Brooks, who have done this absolute, as you can see, look at the poster. This just makes us feel that we want to know more and more. Matt Correa and Milu Cabrera for all the accounting and all the background work, the logistical work. I want to thank the Center of Muslim Experience for collaborating with us on this lecture and things that we're doing further. I want to thank all of you, students and audience who have come here today, because your support means the greatest things to us. Otherwise, we'll be talking among ourselves. Being able to talk to one another gives us hope, gives us courage, gives us strength. So thank you, but thank you most importantly, Laila, if you don't mind to stay on and answer some more questions if you are open to it, because we have so many more. But thank you, everybody. Outside, there is a reception.